Good evening, all. We are now live on Facebook for another episode of Carta the Friday Book Club. It is a very special episode this time. It's the Friday for those who celebrate it, and we have a little bit of a side step from our usual broadcast in terms of the fact that Carta Devineri is usually focused on authors from Romania or authors with an interest in Romania. At this time, it's an actual book that was written in dialogue with somebody from Romania, but it's a little bit different. So we're here with Howard Reich, whom we are going to introduce to you, and my colleagues Andra and Nicola. So I'll pass on to Andra, and hopefully you can stay on and enjoy this conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sorina, and welcome to another Carta Devineri live interview. It is the third one of the year. And we are really, really happy to have a special guest tonight. I'm going to let Nicola introduce him. We also have a few people joining us live within the Zoom session. Please send us your questions either through comments on the social media pages, and we will ask any questions you would like during the meeting. Nicola, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Andra. Yeah, my name is Nicola, and it's my absolute great pleasure and our great pleasure to be able to introduce Howard this evening. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon where you are, Howard, and this evening for us in the UK. Howard was born in Chicago and at the age of 10 moved with his family to the northern suburb of Skokie, a nexus of Holocaust survivors like his parents. And at the age of 16, Howard happened on the film An American in Paris and instantly became obsessed with music. By the age of 18, he had become a piano performance major at Northwestern University. And 4 years later, he began freelancing, writing articles on music for the Chicago Daily News. The following year, he began to produce arts-related coverage for the Chicago Tribune before being hired as a full-time member of staff in 1983. His stories took him not only deep into the heart of one of the most culturally vibrant cities in the world, Chicago, but also to London, to Paris, Warsaw, Vienna, Moscow, Munich, Prague, Havana, and Panama, among many others. After 30 years of serving as the Tribune's jazz critic, Howard was appointed the newspaper's classical and opera critic as well. He retired from the newspaper in 2021 and now lives in a suburb of Chicago with Pam Becker, his wife, a retired Tribune editor. Howard has received 2 honorary doctorate degrees, an Emmy Award, and a Public Advocacy Award from the International Society for Traumatic Studies, as well as numerous other journalistic awards. Aside from The Art of Inventing Hope, which is the book we'll be discussing this evening, Howard is also the author of Prisoner of Her Past, a son's memoir, and 4 books about musicians, jazz and blues music. So yes, thank you again, Howard, for joining us.
It's a pleasure and an honor, and I'm so glad to get to speak to you without having to get on an airplane.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing, isn't it? Well, I'll kick off with the first question just to get things started. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about how these conversations began for those who aren't familiar. What was it that led you to being given, the assignment and to conduct this interview with Elie Wiesel in Chicago back in November 2012?
Well, to tell you, I never even thought I would meet Elie Wiesel, because as I was growing up, as I was a student, Elie Wiesel was kind of a mythic figure, a larger-than-life author. He'd written 60 books, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. How was I to meet him? And yet, some years before I wrote the Elie Wiesel book, I wrote the book about my mother, which you just cited, Prisoner of Her Past. And the publisher at that time was trying to get a blurb for the back from Elie Wiesel, and could not get one. It was impossible to reach him because he had such a lofty status in the world. And then one day, my editor calls me and tells me He's an editor at the Chicago Tribune, where I spent my whole newspaper career. And the newspaper each year gave a literary award to some great luminary of letters, Arthur Miller, other people like that. And my editor told me this year it was going to go to Elie Wiesel. And they said to me, would you be interested in interviewing Elie Wiesel? Well, would I be interested? Would I? Yeah, I'll see if I can work that into my schedule. Of course I'd be interested. And I knew what this meant, or at least part of what this meant. This would mean that I would do an interview with Elie Wiesel, go to New York and run a piece in the paper. And also then we would do a public interview on the stage of Orchestra Hall, the home of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, in front of 2,500 plus people. So this was a very big deal. So the first thing I had to do was I was supposed to call Elie Wiesel and have a very brief conversation with him so that we could just announce that he would be the winner of the 2012 Chicago Tribune Literary Award. And I told myself, I am not telling him about my family history. This is not about me. This is about him. I am not telling him that. And so I called the number. We had an appointment set up. The secretary answers and the assistant. And finally, he gets on the phone. This is Elie Wiesel. You know, it's like the voice of God is rumbling across the ages. So I told him who I was, and I asked him why he's decided to accept the award, what it means to him at this point in his life, what he's working on, a few basic little questions. And I said, and that's all. Thank you very much for your time, sir. And he said, wait a minute, I want to ask you a question. And I was a bit surprised by this. And he said to me, what do you do at the Chicago Tribune? And I said, I'm a music critic. And he said, then why are you doing this story? I thought, wow, that was fast. I've been outed. He figured it out. So I told him immediately what I promised myself I would not tell him. I told him I'm the son of 2 survivors. I've written a book. I've made a film. I've done all of this. And he said to me, send me the book. So I'm thinking, oh, now you want the book. You know, it would have been nice 3 years ago. But anyway, I sent him the book. I flew to, a couple of weeks later, I flew to New York. I should mention one other thing, if I may. There was one other problem with this assignment to interview Elie Wiesel, which was that up until that point in my life, I had never read one word that Elie Wiesel had written. And the reason for that is that reading this Holocaust literature, I find very difficult. That's my family story. And I will do it as an assignment, and that is all. I don't see those movies. I don't watch those TV shows. I don't read those books. But I had to take in 2 weeks, I had to read as much of his work as I could to get ready for the interview in person. So I come to New York for the interview, come to his office. There's a little lobby there. And then he comes out to greet me in the lobby. And we go down a long corridor toward his corner office. And as you walk down this corridor, it was filled from floor to ceiling books. Books. It was like walking through the Library of Congress. And then we came into his corner office, which is a very big room. And he sat on a couch and I sat on a chair, and we were like perpendicular to each other, kitty corner, knees were bumping up against each other. And there's a coffee table in front of us, and it was piled high with books, 3 deep books. You certainly couldn't put a cup of coffee on there, that's for sure. And I now realize, in retrospect, as I think back on it, I think we became friends in the first 4 minutes of that in-person interview. And this is how I know, because he said to me, I want to show you something. Now, by now, he already knew my family's history. He had the book. He knew the background. And he walked across the room, and he comes back, and sits down. He's holding a little yellow pad of paper. And he says to me, I've never shown this to anyone on the outside, certainly never to any journalist. This just recently surfaced. One of my sisters died, and they found this little yellow tablet of paper that I had written when I was 13 years old, at the time of my bar mitzvah, thoughts about mysticism in Hebraic prayers. And that's what this is. And I have heart palpitations to look at this. And I thought, when he shared this very intimate thing with me, we were now on another plane. I started asking him questions. And then every 15 minutes, one of his assistants would come on saying, someone needs to talk to you. Someone's on the phone. And he would shoo them away. And we just kept going for over an hour. It was incredible. So that was part one. I flew back to Chicago. I wrote up 2 big stories that were in the Chicago Tribune, thousands of words, gigantic stories. And then we were going to do the big event in Orchestra Hall. Now, may I go on like this, or did you want me to stop and you want to ask me something else?
No, please carry on, please. Yeah.
Carry on.
Okay, this will be the sort of the end of this chapter of the tale. So we had our event on the stage of Orchestra. You could not get a ticket in Chicago to this event. It sold out immediately. And people were calling me at the Chicago Tribune, how can I get a ticket? What can I give you? How can I bribe you? I can't do anything for you. I've got one seat on stage for me and one seat in the balcony for my wife. That's it. We come on stage. When as soon as we walked on stage, there was a tremendous standing ovation for Elie Wiesel. It was 2,500 people applauding and cheering. The house just kind of shook. We sat down. We had about a 45-minute conversation, brought it to an end. And I'll never forget this amazing thing that Wiesel said to me as we were leaving the stage. He said, "You have not done anything wrong. In all the time we've been together, the phone, New York here, you have not done anything wrong." I said, wow, I didn't realize I was being evaluated that closely, but I'm glad I've passed so far. The people who are presenting this event asked me if I would like to go with him back to the airport in the limo. Well, of course I would. And my wife joined me too. So we hop in the limo driver's in front, and Pam, my wife, me and Elie Wiesel are in the back seat, and we're talking. The conversation is just continuing. It never stopped. We get to the airport. Wiesel flew here in a private plane. So we're waiting for the private plane to get ready to go. So we're talking. Finally, they said it was time for him to leave. This is where it got interesting. He hugs my wife goodbye. He hugs me goodbye. And I thought, at that moment, this has been the most fortunate 4 weeks of my life, because I talked to him on the phone. I visited him in New York. I was on stage of Orchestra Hall, and I rode in the limo with Elie Wiesel, someone I thought I never would meet, and who my publisher could not even get a quote from my previous book. How lucky can a guy get? And then Wiesel says this amazing thing to me. He says, "You've got my number, right?" And I said, you mean your phone number in New York? And he said, "Yeah, you've got my number, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes off onto the plane. And I'm thinking, what does he mean by that? Am I supposed to call him and ask him, how's it going? I mean, I would never presume. And I was torturing myself the next week. What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to call him? Or does he say that to all the girls? So I didn't know what to think. And then another week went by, and finally, almost 2 weeks later, I'm back in Orchestra Hall, but this time I'm in the audience about to review a performance. And looking at the stage and seeing in my mind where Elie Wiesel and I were almost 2 weeks ago, it suddenly hit me. This is a book. This is a book. Two people, a survivor, a son of survivors, talking about the aftermath. Now I will call him. So that Monday, I decided to call him. And I did not know if he would remember me 2 weeks and 1 day later. I mean, presidents and prime ministers are calling him all the time. So I called the number, the assistant came on, the secretary came on, and finally he comes on. And the amazing thing, when he comes on the phone, he doesn't even say hello. He says, "I've told many people about you." And I thought, wow, that's amazing. I thought either that means he thinks I'm somebody else, which I've got no problem with, that's fine, or he really had a good time talking to me. So anyway, I proposed to him this idea. We have the beginnings of a book here. And he said, the only question is time, by which he meant his time, because he's constantly jetting around the world. And I said, we already have 2.5 hours of interviews. You know, how difficult could this be? He said, set it up. So this was on the phone call. The orchestral interview was November 30th of 2012. The phone call was in December. January, he spent every winter in Florida, lecturing at Eckerd College. January I was in Florida interviewing, and thus began 4 years of recorded conversations with Elie Wiesel. That's how this happened. That's how this all snuck up on me with no plan of mine at all.
Wow.
Fantastic. I am almost tempted to ask you more about your experience about writing, also because when I read the book and you were talking about your own story, particularly your realization about the difficulties that your mother was going through, it reminded me of a story that belongs to my family, which is completely different. It's actually one of our neighbors who was from North Bukovina, from north of Romania, who had been displaced by the Russians just after the Second World War and brought into the south of Romania, dropped in the middle of the plains, no shoes, no clothes, no water, no food, as a child. And she managed to survive that. Her family, not so much, not all of them anyway. But in her old age, she'd started, like your mother, going through Alzheimer and dementia, and she was reliving those moments. My aunt would find her on her balcony, crying and shivering and saying that the wolves were going to surround her, or people were stealing her food, or things like that. And it was very, very difficult to actually calm her down. So that memory, and that evil that essentially tried to eliminate you and didn't manage to, somehow still tries to get its own. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us more about the experience of writing about these memories, and if there's any particular examples that you can recall in terms of and Jewish from that part of the world, so Romania or Central and Eastern Europe, for that matter, that you want to expand on.
So yes, I should say a little bit about this backstory of my parents, and specifically my mother. I feel that I spent most of my adult life up until age 49 trying to avoid this subject. It was too overwhelming. It was too dark. My parents are survivors. My aunts and uncles, those who lived, are survivors. My family was wall-to-wall Holocaust survivors. And as a kid growing up, it can be overwhelming. But something happened with my mother on the night of February 15, 2001. By then, she was a 69-year-old widow living alone in our little house in Skokie. And she packed 2 shopping bags of her clothes, and she fled late at night and was running on the streets of Skokie until she was picked up by the Skokie police and brought to a relative's house. The next day she was brought home again, and the next night she did it again. So we had to put her in a place where she could be safe. I did not realize that at the time what she was doing was reenacting her Holocaust childhood. I did not know what her Holocaust childhood was because my parents told me almost nothing about their past. And this was typical of Holocaust survivors. They, in general, and I've interviewed many of them through the years, they generally did not want to burden us children with these stories. And they often said there are no words to describe what happened anyway. And of course, they wanted to put away the worst part of their life, as anybody would. So I didn't know the story. But what's amazing is even the psychiatrists who evaluated or tried to evaluate why my mother was running the way she was, they diagnosed her with delusional disorder. And when I looked up what delusional disorder is in the diagnostic statistical of mental disorders, it just says you're having hallucinations or auditory. It says nothing. A year later, I got the diagnosis. My mother was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, late or delayed onset. It was all coming back at her. And my wife, who is very, very bright, made a connection that I didn't. The night my mother ran out, as I mentioned, February 15, 2001, was the exact 10th anniversary of the death of my father. And the PTSD literature says there's often a trigger, an anniversary, a birthday, a news story that pushes someone over into this realm of psychosis. And that happened to my mother. So now, for the first time in my life, at age 49 or whatever I was forced to confront this story that I've been avoiding all my life. And I think, fortunately, because I'm a journalist, I was able to. I told my editors we should do a story about this. They sent me around the world. And as best I could, I pieced together the story of what happened to my mother. That became the book, Prisoner of Her Past, which also became a documentary film and that has aired across the United States many times. This was the background for me getting to know Elie Wiesel. One thing Elie Wiesel said to me that's not even in the book, he said to me at one point, we should have met 30 years ago. And you know what I said to him? I wasn't ready. I wasn't there yet. You know, this is the time when I was ready. And although I only had 4 years with him, I'm grateful for those 4 years. And as you said earlier, These stories of Holocaust survivors or survivors of any kind of trauma, not just Holocaust survivors, earthquakes, anything. These traumas can't come back to you late in life. When you're older, you're struggling, maybe you're left alone, your spouse has died, you're not as busy with the hurly-burly of everyday life. And those memories that you've tried to put away as much as they can, they come back. And I'll just say one more thing, which is that to this day, my mother, who is very much alive, and in a few days will be turning 93, my mother believes to this day there's a yellow Star of David on her clothes. And to have a yellow Star of David on your clothes, it meant you were marked essentially for death. So she doesn't think it's 1942. She knows it's the present, but she can't untangle the present and the past. And so I would just say this one last sentence, which is, with the book Prisoner of Her Past, I tried to find out what happened to my mother and to my family. And with the book The Art of Inventing Hope, I tried to understand why. And Elie Wiesel was the one who could guide me through that.
Just to interrupt quickly before the next question, but I made a note of your words in the book at one point, and you had a very poignant conversation with a doctor, a psychiatrist, and you said, "What if I hadn't become a writer?" And they said to you, "Why do you think you became a journalist?" So
I think, yeah, some things are just are preordained. I don't know what I would do with this story. I would explode if I couldn't put this story somewhere once I discovered it, but maybe if you're a composer, you do it in a form of music. Words are how I express. I said at one time with Elie Wiesel, what if you hadn't become a writer? What if you become a musician? You know what he said? There are others who are better conductors than me. If my work is to have any weight at all, my work is with words. And I think that's what happened. And I also discovered, this may come up later, but my father and Elie Wiesel were liberated from Buchenwald together on April 11, 1945. And my wife always says that Elie Wiesel and I were just somehow destined to meet each other. And at least that did happen, and I'm grateful.
Thank you, Howard. And thank you for very fortuitously anticipating our next question, actually, which is about the role of words and the role of silence. There's an entire chapter in the book about it, and we don't want to spoil the surprise for those who haven't read it yet. But I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about that, the role of words, the role of writing, the role of saving these memories. And it takes me back to a book that I read when I was 14, which I mentioned earlier before we started the call. I was given as a school prize a book called The Language of Death, and it's written by another Romanian-born Jewish author called Dora Velustig, who was also imprisoned at Auschwitz. And the book is a dictionary of camp slang. It's really tough to read. It's fairly explicit in how it portrays those events. And for me, it's stayed with me for over 30 years now. And I'm sure there are other books for other people who hold a similar role. So if you could talk to us a little bit about that, please. Thank you.
Okay, one of the first things I would say is one of the things I learned in these 4 years with Elie Wiesel, which helped me to interpret growing up with a family of survivors, is the eloquence of silence. That silence is not blank. Silence says something. And I think by my parents and many other survivors not telling their children about what happened, that is their testimony. They're telling it through their silence. They're saying that this story is so monumental that words do not suffice. Words cannot capture it. I was so startled that Professor Wiesel would say to me often, I've never been satisfied with what I've written about the Holocaust. I've never gotten it right. Now, this is amazing coming from someone who's received a Nobel Peace Prize for his writing and speaking, someone whose book, Night, remains one of the seminal tomes on the subject that millions of people still turn to, he finds his writing inadequate. And I think the reason he does is because he feels that words are inadequate. He says words cannot express what that was like. And if you weren't there, you don't know what it was like to be there. You can never know what it was like there. So I would say to him, well, then why write? If it's an exercise in futility, why write at all? And he said that the word, it's not a failure of language. It's a failure of humanity.
Mm.
The words do what they can do, but when humanity commits genocide on this scale, on an industrial scale, language never was designed to express that. He often wondered, he said, did the Nazis envision these events to be so catastrophic, so monumental that no one would believe? That later people say, no, it couldn't have happened. It couldn't. And of course, we know they do say it. There were deniers then, and there always have been desire. I have to press this button here. So the silence is important. Another aspect of silence is the book Night itself. As we know Night to be a very slender book, just 100-some pages. It's that way because of how much Elie Wiesel has left out.
Mm.
Now, Elie Wiesel wrote Night in Yiddish. What many people don't know, perhaps most people don't know, is that the original version of Night is over 800 pages. And Elie Wiesel could not get that book published. He went publisher to publisher in the 1950s. And it wasn't until Francois Mauriac, a Nobel Literature laureate, championed the book that it got published by a small publisher and was quite obscure for a couple of generations. So I asked Wiesel, well, do you ever want to publish the full-length version of Night, 800 pages? The world would want to know. And he said, no. I said, well, why not? He said, because I know what's in it. I said, yeah, but I don't know what's in it. But he felt the power of leaving things out. He says after his father died, he says nothing more about what that experience was like. He said his life ended after his father died.
Mm.
He said he did not talk about what happened with his two surviving sisters. He did not talk about what happened at the selection. I think he felt that these subjects were so sacred that you must not violate that. You must have respect for those who survived and even more respect for those who did not survive. And yet, Elie Wiesel dedicated his life to words, to writing, which is sort of an exercise in futility for him because he felt he never found the right words. But he said, we have children to educate, we have society to educate, we have to enlighten. This is our mission. And so he would also say along these lines, I considered Wiesel to be a very optimistic, hopeful person. This is one of the reasons the book is called The Art of Inventing Hope. He loved life and he was hopeful in spite of all that happened. And so I said, I would ask him in light of all that has happened, the genocide, the killings that keep going to now, how do you feel? Are you optimistic? He actually said, I'm pessimistic, but he said it's an active pessimism.
Mm.
And I never heard that term. What do you mean by that? He said by that he means that when you are failing, when you are not succeeding, you must work even harder instead of giving up. It means that in the face of failure, you keep trying harder. The mission becomes more important, not less so. And so even though he felt his words, his beautifully chosen words, his poetic words, he wrote about the subject and nobody else, even though he felt they did not suffice, he had to keep writing. This was his mission. To him, I think writing was like breathing. There was no time I knew him in which he wasn't writing. So those are some of my initial thoughts on words and on silence.
Mm. Well, we'll come back to Elie Wiesel's mission of hope and sort of what was encompassed in that. But first, I wanted to go back to your mentioning of music and the relationship between your early life and experiences of growing up as a child of survivors and your love of music, and then also the importance for music, not only for you, but also for your father and for Wiesel. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
You're so right. Now that you pointed out, I think you could say music was a leitmotif shared by my father, by myself, and by Elie Wiesel. My father, a survivor, his story was different than my mother. My mother spent years running and hiding until she finally survived. My father's story was similar to what we know about many survivors, various concentration camps, labor camps, a death march to Buchenwald in January of 1945, almost expiring in Buchenwald from typhus, and then somehow surviving to be liberated on April 11, 1945. My father told me he would sing in temple when he was a child. And back then he had a high voice, as you have when you're young. He would sing falsetto. And he said when he sang high voice, everybody in the temple was looking. Who was singing? Who was singing? He played accordion. And when he was recovering in Wiesbaden, it took him a year to recover from the physical debilitations he had suffered. He bought an accordion, a Hohner accordion, and he learned to play the accordion. Music was in our house was always on. I found records my father had. But my father had to make a living. He came to the United States. He had to support himself. So he worked in what his family did. They were bakers. He became a baker. And he never could fulfill that dream of becoming a musician. I think in a way, I sort of tried consciously or unconsciously to pick up that dream. And I became a piano major at Northwestern University and spent my whole career writing about music. And Wiesel, there's this passage in the book, in fact, where Wiesel played violin. I asked him once, why do so many Jews play violin? You know what he said? Because it's portable. Jews are on the run. Jews are running. You can take the fiddle with you. Fiddler on the Roof, a precarious existence, the fiddle. And there's a scene in Night, I now recall, where Elie Wiesel is with a number of people, a number of Jews. Some are dead, some are barely alive. He's barely alive. And one of them, named Juliak, has a violin. He has his battered violin. And he plays a few phrases of the Beethoven Violin Concerto. And by the next morning, Juliak is dead and the violin is destroyed. And Elie Wiesel said, after that, I promised myself I will never play the violin again. And he never did. He listened to music, but he never played. And I cannot listen to the Beethoven Fiddle Concerto to this day without thinking of that moment. So I think music was inextricable from Elie Wiesel's life. After the war, he was 15 and a half or 16 years old. He was brought to Paris, learned to speak French, and he created a choir. And he had many women volunteer to be in his choir. And he said he had so many beautiful women in his choir that he had no difficulty attracting men to be in the choir because they wanted to be there with the girls. So he was a choir director. But ultimately, words prevail. He felt words were his destiny. That is what he had to do. But we would talk about music often, Elie Wiesel and I. And this knocked me out. He would say that he envied me. And Elie Wiesel envied me because I was a music critic for the Chicago Tribune and I could get into any concert I wanted to at a moment's notice and I would get the best seats in the house and they'd be all waiting for me. Now, I'm sure if Elie Wiesel wanted to go to any concert, they would be very happy to accommodate him too. But he said, I envy you, so I can live with that. But we would talk about musicians we loved. He loved Arthur Rubinstein, so did I. And I thank you for pointing it out. This is something that connects the three of us, Elie Wiesel, my father, and I, music.
Well, you say very poetically that that like religion, music takes us beyond the corporeal and its powers cannot be easily explained. And you say that for you, as for many, music provided a kind of and provides still a kind of refuge and comfort, because you say you used to listen to music when you were younger, as a teenager, perhaps to kind of escape these feelings of or the experience you felt of turbulence and discord in at home.
Exactly. In fact, so my parents and uncles and aunts were arguing and yelling all the time. It was noise. I mean, these were people I now understand were injured, were psychologically injured, and were distrustful, and were distraught, and were angry, and had every reason to be angry. And so it fulminated. Our house shook. And so I discovered that when I practiced the piano in our living room, the grand piano, and when I'm pounding on that piano, you can't hear them. And that became my ticket out. And listening to music also transports you. I spent my newspaper career going to concerts. The greatest part of my day would be 8 p.m., 9 p.m. when the music starts. And it doesn't matter if it's a great concert or a bad concert. The sound is coming at you and everything else goes away. Everything else goes away. And music is the balm and it takes you to another place. And I think when Elie Wiesel spoke about that, he said, I speak to you as a Hasid, in other words, a very religious Jew who tried to reach these mystical heights. who try to go above the mundane that we live every day into another place. And I think music takes us to another place. To other people, something else might take them to that place. But Elie Wiesel was very much in tune with this mystical world. And and we can talk about this later. He said this also about the nature of memory. But he was keenly sensitive to what he felt was happening above and around us. And you felt that, I feel, being in his presence. And music was one of the ways to get there.
I'm really glad that you both actually mentioned religion and the fact that Elie Wiesel was a Hasid, because throughout the book, when I read it, I just finished reading it the second time a few days ago. I couldn't think of anything else but this verse in John, first chapter in the Bible, that says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So for me, the fact that he was looking for the right words is a very good illustration of the fact that he was looking for life, because words are life. It's the moment you express something is the moment that thing becomes alive. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe enlighten us a little bit more about your experience of writing, the art of hope, of inventing hope, and maybe elaborate on your conversations with Elie Wiesel, trying to find the right words, trying to put the right emotions across, and maybe how you managed to capture those conversations. We were talking at the very beginning of just before we went live that we're here in a completely different setting than what you guys used to have in the past using technology. So if you were to think about it today, what's the impact of that if you have to write again podcasts and social media and Zoom and YouTube and I don't know what does that mean to you?
Well, to answer that part, I think it helps us spread the word. It doesn't help us create the word, but it helps us spread it. We can disseminate it better than ever. And if this kind of communication had been around in the 1940s, might the history have been changed? Might the Holocaust not have happened? Then again, people knew then and nothing was done. But I want to tell you about the process of the words. So I had an unusual problem, a delightful one, which is every time I interviewed Professor Wiesel with my tape recorder running, if I had an appointment for 1 hour, he said, let's do it an extra hour. If my appointment was for a morning, he said, come back in the afternoon. If I was scheduled to be in Florida for 2 days, he said, stay an extra day. So it was growing. It was growing. I mean, I had too many words. So finally, I had to transcribe all this. And I know there are computer programs, speaking of technologies, that will do the transcribing. I will not do that. I must do it the old-fashioned way. And the reason is, when I transcribe, I'm typing it not only on the screen, but it's engraving into my mind. It's I'm perceiving every word because I'm hearing it and recording it, and I'm typing it with my fingers, and I'm seeing it on the screen. It is becoming a part of me. It's not something the machine has spit out for me. So I was doing this with hours and hours and hours and hours of our interviews. So finally, I had like 2 gigantic fact notebooks of nothing but Elie Wiesel's words, mountains and thousands of words. So what do I do with this? How do I shape this into a book? That became the next challenge. And so what I found I had to do was I had to study all these transcripts and write down what subject or themes we were talking about in any part of the transcript. The problem is when people talk, as I do now, they go from one subject to another. In the middle of the sentence, they might think about something else, and they're hitting another theme, and then they're back in the first theme, and then on the third theme. So if you saw my manuscripts now, my transcripts of all these, it looks like a map of Lithuania with arrows. It's all over. So I broke it down into these themes. So when I finally had these themes, then I saw how the chapters would fall out. And I wrote these chapters, and then I had to break them up into smaller chapters because it was too much. So this was the process that I worked on over the course of these 4 years. Well, finally, I've got the manuscript. And at the beginning of this process, I told Professor Wiesel, no one will see this manuscript before you do. Not my wife, not my literary agent, not any publisher. No one will see it before you. He didn't ask me, but that's what I said. He said, okay. So I'm finished. Well, now now it's showtime. I've got to put it up. So I called him up. It was winter. He was in Florida then. I said, I've got the manuscript. So he says, send it to me and then come in a couple of weeks. I'll read it. So I sent it to him with some trepidation. I made my plane ticket to come to Florida. And I said, well, now we'll find out. It's been almost 4 years. We'll find out. Did I do it or didn't I do it? Did I find the right words or did I not find the right words? And so I arrived in Florida that evening. We had an appointment to meet that morning in his hotel, as we had been doing for years. We meet in the lobby of his hotel, as always. And I noticed he is not holding the manuscript I sent him, that notebook, and then which I thought a little concerning. And then we sat down at the chairs where we always sat to conduct these interviews, just off the lobby of the hotel, and pleasantries. How are you? What have you been doing? Blah, blah. And finally, I couldn't take it anymore. And I said, you received the manuscript I sent you, right? He said, right. And I said, well, would you like to go over the manuscript? Would you like? And he said, no, you don't want to? He said, no, it's fine. Very good. Nothing to change. And that was the entire editing process between Elie Wiesel and me on that book. I had booked a week in Florida to go over that manuscript with him. So we spent the rest of the time just sitting at the pool talking to each other. This was the nature of our conversations. Our conversations kind of took on a life of their own. And then I dealt with my agent, dealt with the publisher, and I just assumed that Elie Wiesel would be alive when the book came out. And maybe he'd write a foreword or we'd do something together. It never dawned on me that someday Elie Wiesel would die. And then in July 2016, I found out with the rest of the world that he died. And I was stunned. Someone talked to him all the time. I was stunned. And I shouldn't have been this 87-year-old Holocaust survivor who'd been through such physical torture during the Holocaust and had traveled the world talking about his themes and had done so much to change how the world thinks about survivors, that he would not live forever. And so I was saddened that he wouldn't be here when this book came out, but I was grateful that he saw the manuscript and he told me it was okay, because otherwise I would have always wondered, did I do it or didn't I? Did I miss it or did I get it? And that I met his approval meant a great deal to me. I will say as a final thought on this, that the book is not long. It's just about a couple hundred pages. And it does not contain everything of our interviews. There's a lot of other material that is not in this book. I just included what fit thematically. So I've never decided what to do with the rest of it, but I do have these manuscripts and these recordings, and we'll see. But I'm glad I got this down, and I'm grateful that Elie Wiesel read it and approved.
Yeah, what a relief. Just to interject quickly. Yeah, because it's obviously incredibly clever the way you interweave these conversations with your own kind of thoughts and feelings and observations, and also family history and testimony. It's not simply a record of the conversations. So yeah, it must have been an incredibly tough thing to do, to kind of to really mold that material, all of that material that you had, into what became the book.
It was a little dizzying because I didn't want this to be like a ping pong game. He said, I said, he said, I said. It's so boring to read. But what happened was, when he would say something, it reminded me of something my parents said. Or if he would have a memory, it reminded me of a question I had, and that would lead to another question. And each time I would come to Florida or New York, I'd have more questions. And it became an interweaving of his thoughts and how I could apply his thoughts to my experience. And I think I would say one thing about this. So why did Elie Wiesel agree to do this? That's a fundamental question. Why? I mean, many books have been written about him. He's written 60 books. Why did he agree to spend so much time with me? And I believe that he wasn't just spending time with me. He was speaking, I think, to the whole generation of children of survivors and grandchildren of survivors and grandchildren of people who've survived other traumas. I think he was sharing with the world his last thoughts, what turned out to be his last thoughts on this subject. It was not just me. It was through me. One thing he said is that he just loves children of survivors. They mean so much to him. To him, they are the future. So I think I was a beneficiary of that, and I think I feel fortunate that he trusted me. But the idea was to weave his commentary against or alongside or within my family's history, so that other people reading the book, children of survivors, grandchildren, can see their own histories and learn from him as I did.
Thank you, Howard. And once again, in answering the previous question, you have very elegantly segued into the next one that we had prepared for you. The book was published, what, less than 5 years ago. Historically, so many things have happened. And some of those are really unfortunate historical events of the type that you talk about in the book. You know, conflict has continued, group violence has continued, ethnic cleansing, and so on. We've also been through a pandemic, and there have been changes to discourse in several big democracies. We're not going to dive into that one. But it feels like a lot of the things that Ellie was talking about, around understanding, about dialogue, about how people with different views can come together and have a discussion. It feels like we have moved so far away from that in these past few years. If you were to republish the book today or in the near future, would you add anything else to it? You mentioned a foreword earlier. Would you add a slightly different foreword, or would you do anything else with the material to take into account what has that happened? Or would you leave it as it is because it is still incredibly poignant and relevant?
At the most, what I would do is perhaps write a foreword addressing the issues that you have just mentioned. But the ideas that Elie Wiesel expresses, the anti-Semitism that he fought against, the horrors that he experienced, are unfortunately, apparently, timeless. Elie Wiesel considered anti-Semitism the world's oldest hatred. Often people ask me, what would he say about this anti-Semitic attack or that anti-Semitic attack? And I know you never know what he would say, but here's what I feel he would say, or at least I can say what he often said to me. I'm shocked but not surprised. He was shocked that these mendacities still continued, but not surprised that he continued because they always do. He said he once gave an address at the UN, and he said, have we learned from the Holocaust? No, because genocide keeps happening. So all of these events that you have mentioned, it seems to me, are echoes of the events that happened in the book. They may be different in magnitude. We've had pandemics. There was a pandemic in 1918, we know. Genocides happened before, during, and after the Holocaust. Although the word genocide, of course, was coined during the Holocaust for the Holocaust. So Israel always has been under siege. I don't think even Elie Wiesel would, like I say, he'd be shocked, but not surprised by what is happening. All I would need to do is maybe reference what has happened in these past few years, but the human struggles, the human flaws, the evil that humanity is capable of, and the beauty and art that humanity are capable of seem to remain constants. And I think that's one of the reasons people still read Night all these 80-some years after. It's all too fresh. It's all too topical. It's all too timely. Only the technology changes. Otherwise, it's the pendulum going back and forth. That would be my thoughts on that.
Fantastic. We were actually talking about some words before we joined the call with Nikolai, and one of the things that we tried very hard not to do was to essentially share each other's impressions of the book, because we wanted to keep our own very individual perspectives. So I tend to focus on the absence of revenge, the act of witnessing, the taking action and protesting, and then the memory side of things. And there is one word there, Nicola, that you haven't considered: the faith. That underpins it all. And as Wiesel said, he never judged people who lost their faith, but equally he couldn't have envisaged life without his faith, because that's what kept everything going and kept him going. So I'm gonna let Nicola talk about the words that she chose, and then we can come back potentially to mine. If that's okay, Nicola.
Yeah. Well, it was coming back to to Elie Wiesel's truths and sort of words of wisdom, and what was encompassed in his kind of innate hopefulness. Serena's covered several of them, but there were love and resilience were also mentioned. I mean, I don't think I need to say more at this point, but maybe we could go back to the first one, which was the act of witnessing, and from there to the absence of revenge. Because I mean, it's just incredible that, given the experiences, given Wiesel's experiences and the experiences of many other Jews, that was the case, despite having been a witness in that position, in that horrific position.
And if I can interject there, it brought me to a different period of history in Romanian history, and that's under the communists. There's a Romanian Jew and his wife who were imprisoned. Their names are Richard and Sabina Wurmbrand. And the one thing that Richard said was, when you come face to face with your jailer or your torturer, you have a choice to make. It's your choice how you're going to interact with that person. Are you going to acknowledge them as a human being and avoid this need for hatred and any other negative feelings? Are you going to let yourself move on and just breathe out of that situation? Or are you going to just tie yourself down with everything that the past had in store for you?
Shall I weigh in now?
Yeah, go for it.
So along these lines, and this relates to revenge, it goes a step back. One thing that Professor Wiesel said to me, and it's in the book, is he said, and this surprised me, he said something like, the worst sin I could commit is a sin of humiliation. I will not humiliate another person. And he had the opportunity, because he was in Israel after the war, and he sees on a bus, I think it was 1949 or so, the barracks leader of his barracks, and that's a very tough person that one might feel very angry toward. And he said, I could confront him, I could humiliate him, or not. And he decided not to. He said, it is not my right to humiliate someone else. And that was so important to him. And this relates to revenge. He said, there were some people after the Holocaust, some Jews who wanted to do revenge, but mostly no. He said, if you look in the archives, you will not find criminal behavior. He said, that is not what we do. That is not what Judaism is about. That is not what our tradition is about. We are civilized. We will not descend to that level. We will not say, they could have said, you took from me, I'm going to take from you. He said, we would not do that. It is not a part of who we are. And maybe this relates too to the word that you'd mentioned, faith, because as you said, faith defines Elie Wiesel to a large extent. It's very important to him. It doesn't mean that his faith was not tested by what happened. It was. He often said, and he's written that the experience of the Holocaust, he said Jews were abandoned by God and betrayed by humanity. This is what he said. But he said, I will believe in God in spite of God. That's what he said. I will believe in God in spite of God. He said, my grandfather believed, my father believed, I believed. He said, that doesn't mean I don't struggle with it. He said, if you decide not to believe, that's easy. It's all done. I don't believe, everything's fine. He said, that's too easy. The struggle is much more interesting to me. I would much rather struggle. He said, our Jewish tradition is filled with questions that are contradicted by other questions. So the fundamental point for him was, I can struggle inside of the faith or outside of the faith. And he chose, without any doubt, to struggle inside of the faith. And that remained a part of his being. It wrapped up with who he was. And therefore, if you're going to see your life inside of the faith, you are not going to pursue revenge, because that contradicts the faith. And I think that may be the place where these two ideas intersect.
And again, you write poetically, very poetically, that Wiesel said that for Jews, hope is more than an aspiration, and it's an imperative, in fact, and that as Jews, you are ordered to hope. And yeah, that's incredibly powerful, isn't it? That yeah, you're ordered to go on clinging to hope, as you say, even though it seems that there is no hope.
Yes, he said we are forbidden to despair. He said, what is despair? Despair is a choice. I give up. I'm done. He said, no, if you're a believing Jew, you must hope. People ask me, why did you title the book The Art of Inventing Hope? Well, that was a phrase that Professor Wiesel said to me all the time. He said, my job is the art of inventing hope where there is no hope, and giving hope to my students, to my readers. And it's easy to say that, but having been through what he's been through, he has the right to say that. Because if he can sustain hope, having lost almost everything, having lost his parents, his young sister, his people, millions of Jews, having lost all that, and he can remain hopeful, how can we not? How can we not follow his lead? At the same time, I would hasten to say, point out that I said to him at a point, you're really kind of like a conscience to the world. And he said, don't say that. I am nobody's conscience. Everybody has their own conscience. With all my faults and all my transgressions, I am not a saint. I don't make a saint out of me. I'm a person. So he did not want to be anyone else's conscience. He simply said, and this relates to one of the words that you said earlier, witness. He said, my job is to be a witness. By this, he means something very specific. He sees what happens, he tries to understand it, and he shares it with the rest of us. It means he's not a judge. He does not want to judge us. As was alluded earlier, he said, you must respect, you must not, I think his words were, you must not spit on the man who renounces his faith. He is fulfilling his destiny. He respected those who chose otherwise. He just didn't. And so he saw himself as a witness and a teacher. And that's why I named the book The Art of Inventing Hope, because this was his mission in life. And I'll just say one more thing about this, which is, I alluded to a little earlier. I believe that Elie Wiesel changed the world's perception of Holocaust survivors. Because after the war, Holocaust survivors in general were looked at in a very pitiful and pitiable way. They were often, why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you fight back? I told Wiesel, I think trying to live when you're being starved and tortured is a form of fighting back. And he said, I'll go you a step further. Trying to believe is a form of resistance. So he was determined to extend this hope and to rid us of this idea that Jews who survived were just victims. He taught the world how to see the survivors in a more heroic light. They'd lost everything, and yet they started again. They learned new languages. They came to new countries. They got jobs. They got married. They had children. They had grandchildren. They built fortunes. They wrote books. This is what they did after having everything taken away from them. Also, often even their names. And so the world now, I think, mostly those who recognize and acknowledge what happened, view Holocaust survivors with a kind of awe, as well they should. And that changed because nobody said more about this subject sooner than Elie Wiesel.
Yeah, and to go back to the fact that Serena mentioned taking action and protesting, which very much is in line with what you just said about Elie Wiesel changing the perception of Holocaust survivors. You know, having the strength to take action even when you think it's futile, but and always continuing to protest and to try and affect change, you know, requires incredible strength.
Yes, and he said, sometimes I feel all I do is protest. That's all I do is protest. Nothing changes. People, he said, listen to me, but they hear me, but they don't listen to me. But he said, you have to protest, if only as a statement of who you are. And you mustn't give up, because he said, there are deniers now, and there'll be more deniers later. And we are getting close to the point where there will be very few survivors actually living. My mother is one of the younger survivors, and she's soon going to turn 93. We are getting to the end, where all we will have are the children of survivors, the books, the testimonies, and all. But this is why this idea of witness was so important to Elie Wiesel, because he always said, to hear a witness is to become a witness. So he made witnesses all over the world. And I have to tell you, wherever I go to speak across the United States and beyond, there's not one place I speak where someone in the audience doesn't stand up and say, oh, I heard Elie Wiesel speak, because he did this nonstop for 60 years. He may have reached as many people in person as he did with his books, because he was constantly telling this story practically to his last breath. So he made us all witnesses. And I think all of us who are on this call right now are now witnesses to tell the story to others and to the future.
And that's our burden, which we definitely gladly accept. And it's one of the values and the visions that we hold that in our organization, our little organization, about the Romanian implication in the Holocaust and the need to keep this conversation going about what has happened then and what we don't want to see happen again. Which is why it's important to talk about memory as well as everything else. I think Jane has a question. Go ahead.
Hi, Serena and Howard. Thank you so much for sharing. It was amazing. Thank you. I think I just want to say kind of like, I'm so jealous because Elie Wiesel is one of my heroes and I would have loved to have met him. But one of the things that we do is myself and Alex and Caroline as well. I think that's Caroline Slifkin, who's another one of our educators. Is we do readings at various points when we go around. When we take the young people around, we go to the town of Oswiecim, which I think very few people do when they visit. We actually, you know, to talk about pre-war Jewish life, that this was a vibrant Jewish town. You know, it was a majority, 58%. 42% Jewish town, and so we take them to the market square, and we take them to the site of the former synagogue, and the new kind of Jewish ascent to this and reconsecrated synagogue, and where we used to go to the Jewish cemetery, which was kind of like one of my favorite places. None of the graves are above real graves, apart from one, which is a real grave, because they're all taken and used as paving stones, you know, humiliation. But we used to kind of like say to the students, go and look for kind of like symbols, because a lot of them, you know, it's in Hebrew, a lot of the students couldn't read Hebrew. And we'd say kind of like, look for dove, because that's Sephora. And then when we went to kind of Birkenau on the selection ramp, we always read apart from night, and we read the bit where he comes into it when at last our illusions are, you know, men to the right, women to the left, when he separates from his mother and Sephora. And I always used to say kind of, do you remember when, because I always used to say to them, go and look for Sephora, look for a dove on a gravestone, because it'll be important later. And then when we kind of do this reading, and to me, there's a reading by Primo Levi that always kind of resonates. But that one that you read from night is so hard, because I always say to the kids, you know, the 16 to 18,
Yeah.
you've got little sisters, you've got little brothers, you've got a nephew, you know, whatever, you know, and think about this. This isn't kind of some museum you're going to. It is, but this is where it happened.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
This is the photographs you saw in Auschwitz 1, you know, this is the ultimate end of the journey.
Yeah.
And I always, you know, I said to them, read Night, you can read it. And I mean, that was fascinating to know it was 800 sides long. I'd love to read that, I have to say. But I always say to them, because we have a pre-meeting with them before we go, and I say, try and read Night, you know, it's 120 sides long, you know, read it.
Yeah.
How many of them do? I don't know. And I sometimes bring it with me and say, does anybody want to read it on the plane? You know, on the plane. Yeah. And it's usually the teachers, because we take some teachers with us as well, who kind of like read it. But fascinating. So just thank you so much for sharing that. It's been a real privilege. Thank you.
Thank you for what you said. And along the lines of what you said, I should mention that I asked Professor Wiesel, why Night? Why is Night the book that the whole world has embraced? He's written what is it about this book? And he said, I have no idea. He said, I've written 60 books and they're all jealous of Night and they haunt me in my dreams. So I should mention this too, that Elie Wiesel was funny. When you were talking to him, we spent a lot of time laughing. He found joy in life, as survivors do. And he would often caution me, don't define the survivors only by their experience of the Holocaust. There's much more to them than that. He was always pointing that out to me, not to look in this one dimension. And he too, he loved the warm weather. He loved chocolate ice cream. He loved music. He loved Brahms. He loved the fiddle. He loved many things.
I mean, one of our kind of regular survivors who spoke to us, who sadly passed away just over a year ago, Ziggy Shipper, and he, you know, he was just amazing, and he was just like that. I have two memories of Ziggy. Once, when he came on stage in front of all these young people, and he said, "I bet you all you think is that I think about the Holocaust." He said, I'm wondering how that nice Jewish girl got on the X Factor last night, you know, and these kids were like,
yeah.
And then he came off stage once, and I'd heard his story so many times, and it always moved me. And he came up to me and he said, Jane, come here. And I said, what? And he said, how are the Arsenal getting on? And I said, what do you mean, Ziggy? I've got no idea. I haven't been looking at the football results, you know. And he said, well, look it up for me now. You know, and it was just, you know, this kind of always proudest as one of the few Jewish people who actually supported Arsenal, you know, and he just loved his football, loved his. Apparently, his grandson said to him once when England were playing Poland, "Who do you support, Granddad?" And he said, "What do you mean? Who do I support? England gave me my life." He said, "I would never support Poland." His grandson was quite kind of, you know, because obviously he was originally from Poland, but it was such a warm, like a lot of people are, you know.
Yeah.
But, you know, he was such a warm man. And I've never seen so many 16 to 18-year-olds queuing up to talk to him, to want to photograph with him, to want to buy his book and, you know, to get him to sign some, you know, it was just wonderful, you know, and, you know, to get that kind of like link between, you know, gosh, 3 generations or whatever.
Yeah.
Just amazing.
That's a beautiful portrait of him. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Jane. That was really good. Great. What other questions do we have, guys? What else do we want to find out?
If not, we have some even more questions for you, Howard. But let's see if anyone from the audience is wanting to ask anything.
I can't see anything on social media yet.
No.
So anyone in the Zoom meeting want to put their hand up? Me.
Go for it.
There's a Romanian saying that doesn't translate very, very well, which is alayo, which means not me.
Just want to say something.
Yes.
I managed to mute myself and unmute myself. I'm sorry, I'm not putting the camera on at the moment, but I wanted to say thank you so much, Howard, if I may call you Howard.
Yeah.
It's incredible to think about the work that you've done to produce what you've done. I have ordered your book while we've been speaking. I apologize for not having read it already, but I really look forward to that. And just to copy what Jane has said, and I know what Caroline, who's also on this call, would say, we always say to students that what Elie Wiesel would say is, once you are told these stories, you become a witness, and now they are witnesses. So although, of course, he's told hundreds of thousands of people that, and your book is telling hundreds of thousands, we also do our bit to try to make sure that people realize the importance of sharing these stories in perpetuity, because of course, as time goes on, there's more denial and distortion and so forth. So it's very important. So that's all. I have nothing really sensible to add, but thank you so much. I'm really dying to get the book.
Thank you so much for what you said. You know, as we writers, we write something and send it out into the world, and you never know who reads it, how they're affected by it. And this session is extremely meaningful for me to hear what this book meant to you, and all the beautiful details you found in it and the light you shed on it, even for myself. So I thank you all.
And I thank you, Howard, because for the third time tonight, you have just introduced my question. My question was going to be about, and again, these are things that you've touched upon earlier, but specifically about the reception of the book and the impact of the book, whether there was a difference between its impact in the US and elsewhere across the world, and also whether it was received differently in different communities, be they cultural communities or religious communities. And following on from that, whether you had any plans to translate it.
So the reaction to the book was quite interesting to me. You know, as I say, you never know what will happen. To give a little context, when I published my first book in 1993, and it was a biography of the pianist Van Cliburn, and this was the first time. And I was a critic. I've been a critic at the Chicago Tribune for many decades. This was the first time really that I would be on the receiving end of criticism, which is an education that all critics should experience. And I was startled by the reviews, because I could draw a line right down the middle and have the reviews in two columns, not only positive or negative, but if someone said something negative about something I did, somebody else said something positive about that exact same thing. In fact, I was considering writing a column showing the uselessness of critics, of which I am one, to point out that every single criticism was a compliment to somebody else. Well, this told me a lot about reviews and being received, which is what I tell musicians all the time when they complain to me. Don't read the reviews if you're going to take them that seriously. The review is not for you. The review is for the readers of that publication, whether it's the Chicago Tribune, New York Times, or whatever. So that was my first education. Now, several books later, the Elie Wiesel book is my sixth book. I was again surprised here, because here, this is just a fact, they were just uniformly positive reviews. I mean, I was just struck by this. I was hoping someone might take a swing at it just for the sake of variety. So I'm not sure what that means. I think it might indicate that this was a good time for Wiesel's message to be heard. So he died in 2016. The book came out in 2019. 3 years later, it was ready. I think people were ready for this. And I was really amazed by how my own newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, responded to this book, which it's a little, it can be a little awkward, since I at the time, of course, was a Chicago Tribune critic. They read an excerpt of the book, but they did this amazing thing. when the book came out in 2019, there was some kind, I can't remember what it was particular, but there's one particular, some kind of particular flare up of anti-Semitism. So the Chicago Tribune, my newspaper, ran a big editorial with a picture of Elie Wiesel about this book and anti-Semitism. That was unprecedented in my lifelong experience of reading the Chicago Tribune. And here it is, 2019, so it's 5 years later. Next week, I'll be at the University of Missouri talking about this book. The interest in me talking about this book has never stopped. It has never been interrupted. So that is extremely gratifying. And although each book I've written, of course, at the time meant everything to me, if forced to say which one means the most to me, which you shouldn't say, like which of your kids means the most to you, which is easy for me to say because I don't have any kids, so I don't have that particular problem. The book about my mother and the book about Elie Wiesel are at the center of me understanding my life, and I hope help other people understand theirs. So I'm just grateful that people have embraced this book. There's a publication which you may or may not know called Kirkus Reviews, Kirkus. They're one of the Bibles of reviewing, and everybody is always wary. Oh no, what is Kirkus going to say? Because they have a certain reputation. I got this rave review from Kirkus. I was thinking, what is going wrong here? So it's been a great experience. We haven't talked about translation. I hope it's translated. I would love to have it translated, of course, in Romanian. But one of the miracles of our age, and this goes back to what we started talking about at the very beginning, technology, is that you can get a book on Kindle. You read it on your screen. Anybody can access any book anytime. It's extraordinary. Never have books had such a long life. And that also is extremely gratifying to me. So my bottom line here is that whenever anybody asks me to come speak about the book, I'm there, whether it's electronically or in person. I travel, and I'll say as a footnote, well, maybe I'll save this for the end, but I've got 2 other projects that are coming out very shortly in the next couple of months that echo the themes of the book about my mother and the book with Elie Wiesel.
Wow.
Oh, that's interesting to mention, because I was actually going to ask, you're such a polymath, being a writer and a maker of documentary films and all sorts, that we touched on this before we went live, but what could you tell us a bit more about what you're working on at the moment, and are you working on any of the books? What are your plans for the future? Because despite the fact you've retired from the Chicago Tribune, you seem to be busier than ever, and incredibly productive. So yeah,
I'm very fortunate. So when I left the Chicago Tribune in 2021, after 43 years of writing for that newspaper about music and the arts, I was finishing up a film. It's a music film called For the Left Hand. And it's about a pianist who lost his ability to play with his right hand and plays left hand repertoire music by Ravel and Prokofiev and so on. But the 2 new projects that I've been working on involved for the past 3 years since leaving the Tribune are coming to fruition in May and in June. So in May will be the world premiere tour of an opera based on another one of my Holocaust-related stories. The opera is called Before It All Goes Dark, and it's premiering in May in Seattle, San Francisco, and Chicago. I'll be on the tour. I did not write the opera, but it's based on my stories. And the opera is being written by the composer Jake Heggie, who's one of America's most prominent operatic composer, and librettist Gene Shear. In a nutshell, this is the story and relates to what we've been talking about today. In 2001, let me just take it back a little bit, and this takes us to Central Europe. After the fall of communism, the new Czech government created new laws mandating the Jewish Museum to find the heirs of art that was looted by the Nazis. The Jewish Museum was able to prove that 30 works belonged to this eminent Jewish businessman named Emil Freund. They could prove it, but they could not figure out who the heir was. They contacted the Art Loss Register, which is based in New York and is a clearinghouse for all sorts of looted and stolen property. The Art Loss Register could not figure that out. The Art Loss Register asked me if I would like to figure it out. They had 2 clues. Emil Freund, the man who was murdered during the Holocaust, had 2 sisters. Those were the clues. It turns out those 2 sisters, as of the 1920s, lived in Chicago. And I found their death notices. And you notice death notices always say survived by, survived by. So then I found those people's death notices. And I built a family tree until I found who I believed would be the heir. And I came to his house, and he was the heir. And he was a Vietnam veteran living on disability checks who had hepatitis C and PTSD and did not know he's partly Jewish or that he's heir to this art collection. I did a front page story in the Chicago Tribune about saying I have identified the heir and I can prove he's the heir, and here he is. And 3 weeks after my story ran, the Czech government sent the Czech Culture Ministry sent the Jewish Museum a letter saying we're considering making half of this collection, identifying half of this collection as national cultural treasures that cannot be taken out of the country or sold on the international marketplace. In other words, they're taking it back again. So this collection will have been looted 3 times, first by the Nazis, then by the communist government, and now again by the Czech government. The Vietnam veteran, whose name everyone called him Mac, Gerald McDonald, he was so mad about this, he was going to go to Prague and try to get the art and see the art. And I went with him. And the opera is his story of trying to get the art back. And he did not succeed in get the art back, but he found out the family history that his family never told him. And this is the opera that's premiering in May in these 3 cities that I told you. So I've been very involved with that. And the other thing quickly is, also after I left the Tribune, I was asked to write the story and scenario for a ballet, an evening-length ballet, about Japanese-Canadian internment. As you may know, during World War II, the United States interned its own American citizens who were Japanese after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Canada did that also. And this ballet is the story of one family. It's based on a true story, 4 generations, 1917 to the present, how this internment affected them and how they transcended it. And both of these stories obviously resonate with Elie Wiesel's book, with the book about my mother. It's all about racism, it's about genocide, it's about how people are treated and how somehow they transcend this horrible mistreatment. And that is what I've been working on since I left the Tribune.
Wow, that's incredibly impressive.
That is indeed fantastic. I think we could like with Wiesel, we could talk for yet another hour, but I'm conscious of the fact that we've already gone half an hour over the time that we have set to ourselves. And one thing that we haven't mentioned so far, but I think it kind of kept me thinking and kept me going throughout the conversation is the picture behind you. Feels like he's actually in the room.
He is in the room. So I have some of my most important people. This is my office. My home office I'm talking to you from. And so there's a picture. I mentioned that we were on stage in Orchestra Hall. So the one where that's us, that's during that event. We're on stage. And this is when he stood up and took a bow. And then some of my other heroes are on the wall too. There's Kirk Douglas, the famous American actor who I always admired, a Jewish actor who was very embraced his Jewish identity. And then above that is a picture of, you probably can't see it, but a picture of my wife with Gene Kelly, who's one of my all-time heroes.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. In fact, if you were in my house right now, if I walked around with the iPad, which I won't do because it'll make us both dizzy, but you would think you were in a Jewish deli, in which all the photos of the various celebrities who had a corned beef sandwich there are on the wall. Because our house is covered with these photos on the walls of all the people I've interviewed over the past 43 years and got to meet.
That's fantastic. And that would be a treasure trove, indeed. You mentioned earlier about the fact that you would like the book translated. So I'm just going to make a personal commitment on that from myself. If you do want that translated, I would definitely be honored to do so, not just for you, not just for Elie Wiesel, but also for my parents.
Yeah, well, that would be great.
Who would love to read it, but obviously it's in English, and I told them about the book, and I told them about the powerful things that I learned from it, and I think are important, need to be kept going. So you have that great commitment.
Yeah, if we could find a Romanian publisher, that would just be wonderful. So we can confer on that later. But thank you.
Okay. I'm
moved and grateful.
So last question of the evening, one that we ask every single author that we've ever interviewed, is what would be your book recommendation for our little program? It has to be, I'm afraid, a book about Romania or a book written by a Romanian writer or
Okay,
a Romanian speaking writer.
Okay, so I'm going to have to give you 3.
Okay.
But there's no extra charge. So,
thank you.
Let's see. The first 2 would be the memoirs of Elie Wiesel, because although everybody knows Knight, it's very valuable to read his 2 volumes of memoirs, because they give the details day by day of what happened to him, and it sets Knight in the context. So those books are called All Rivers Run to the Sea, and the next one's called And the Sea is Never Full. If you need to get a grounding in Elie Wiesel, those 2 books to me are as indispensable as Knight, because they give the context. And then I would refer to the great Romanian playwright Ionesco and his play Rhinoceros, which is still performed here in the United States. So that's the best I can do at the spur of the moment.
That's fantastic. Andrew?
Sorry, I'm giggling because I recommended Rhinoceros in, I want to say, was that the first recommendation of 2021, Sorina? I think it was. Yeah.
Wow. We're on the same wavelength.
Definitely. So thank you ever so much for all your time, all your openness, and for being so approachable and so easy to talk to, and for sharing so much of your experience. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was an honor for me, and the level of this discourse, I feel I just picked up my 3rd honorary doctorate degree talking to you people. So thank you.
Thank you very much,
That's
Howard.
fantastic. Thank you, everybody who's taken the time to spend it with us on Easter Friday. We hope you have a wonderful Easter weekend if you're celebrating, and if not, enjoy your weekend. And we'll see you again soon for another episode in
next week.
Next week with Irina Georgescu this time. So please make sure you eat, because we're going to talk about Romanian food, and among others, all of the ethnic influences in Romanian food. So yeah, that promises to be delicious.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Night, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.